There's a version of this story where the credits roll, where confetti falls, where someone claps. This isn't that story. This is the real one. And I need you to sit with that for a second because what actually happens when you escape, really escape, is stranger, quieter, and somehow heavier than anything the movies ever showed you. Let me take you there. It's 6:14 in the morning, 15 years of your life, 15 years of an alarm clock that felt less like a sound and more like a small daily act of violence against your nervous system. 15 years of the same drive, the same bad scan, the same fluorescent lights humming like they were mocking you. And somewhere in year 11, without ever making a decision to do it, you stopped asking, what do I want to do today? And started asking, what do I have to survive today? Nobody handed you that shift. It just happened to you the way rust happens to a car left out in the rain, slowly. Then all at once you looked and the whole thing was orange and crumbling. You told yourself this was just what adulthood was. Everyone around you seemed to have accepted the same deal, the commute, the meetings that could have been messages. The performance reviews where a stranger with a title decided what your effort was worth in a language of numbers that never quite matched what you actually did. You weren't unhappy, exactly. You were something worse than unhappy. You were numb. And numb doesn't scream for help, numb just keeps showing up. So here's the moment, the one nobody tells you about, because it doesn't look like a movie moment at all. It was a Tuesday, not a dramatic Friday, not a New Year's resolution, not a birthday with some tidy round number attached to it. A random forgettable Tuesday at 2:47 in the afternoon, sitting in a meeting about a meeting that would produce another meeting, and you felt something crack. Not break, crack. Like a windshield that still holds together, but you just know, it's never going to be the same piece of glass again. And in that crack, one sentence slipped through, clear as a bell in a silent room. I don't want to do this for another 20 years. That's it. That's the whole revolution. No trumpets, no slow motion walkout, just a sentence, sitting quietly in your chest, refusing to leave. Here's where the story usually lies to you. In the movies, this is where the hero quits on the spot, storms out, middle finger to the building, triumphant music. But real escapes don't work like that, and if you've ever actually tried to build a different life, you already know this in your bones. Real escapes are boring. Real escapes are spreadsheets at midnight. Real escapes are calculating, for the 11th time, exactly how many months of expenses you have saved, and realizing the number is smaller than your fear wants it to be, and bigger than your doubt wants to admit. For the next 14 months, not 14 days, you lived a double life. By day, you were exactly who they expected you to be. Present in meetings, responsive to messages, a model employee, indistinguishable from the version of you that had no plans of leaving at all. But by night, you became someone else entirely. You learned a skill nobody paid you to learn. You built something small in the dark, on a laptop balanced on your knees at 11 p.m., while the rest of the house slept, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the tapping of your own hesitant, hopeful keys. Nobody clapped for this part. Nobody even knew this part was happening. That's the thing about the real escape, it's invisible until it's finished, and sometimes even after. You failed constantly during those 14 months. Not big dramatic failures, small, humiliating ones. The client who never replied. The idea that flopped after 3 weeks of work. The version of the plan that fell apart because you miscalculated a number that, in hindsight, should have been obvious. Each failure whispered the same old lie. Go back to sleep. Go back to numb. Numb was safer than this. But something had changed. The crack in the windshield doesn't heal. Once you heard that sentence, I don't want to do this for another 20 years, you cannot unhear it. It becomes a low, constant hum underneath everything else. The way a refrigerator hums so long you forget it's there until the day it stops and the silence is somehow louder than the noise ever was. Let's talk about the day you actually left, because here's the part that will genuinely surprise you. You'd imagined this moment for over a year, rehearsed it in the shower, pictured the look on people's faces, pictured, if you're honest, a small amount of vindication, some quiet moment where the people who doubted you, or the system that ground you down, would finally see what they'd been sitting on top of. None of that happened. You handed in your resignation on a Thursday morning. Your manager nodded, said the standard things people say: "We'll miss you. Good luck with what's next." The way you'd say those words to someone changing seats on a plane. Two coworkers said congratulations in the hallway with the specific brightness people use when they're being polite rather than moved. By Friday afternoon, someone else's name was already being floated for your role. The machine didn't pause. The machine didn't even blink. And here's the sentence that's gonna sting. Because it's true. The system you spent 15 years feeding never needed you specifically. It needed a version of you. Any competent, compliant version would do. You could have been replaced by 100 different people wearing your job title, and the meetings would still happen. The reports would still get filed. The lights would still hum exactly the same shade of fluorescent white. That's the cruelest and most freeing realization of the entire escape. You thought you were essential. You were, in fact, interchangeable. And once you understand that, really understand it, not just intellectually but in your gut, something in you goes quiet in the best possible way. Because if you were never essential to them, you were never really theirs to keep. Here's the part of the story that nobody prepares you for, and it's the part that actually deserves the word story, because it has a twist. You expected the escape to feel like victory. What it actually felt like for the first several weeks was grief. Grief for the identity you'd spent 15 years building, even if you hated it. Grief for the structure that told you every single day exactly who you were supposed to be between the hours of 9 and 5. Grief, strangely, for the complaints, the inside jokes about bad coffee, the shared sighs in the elevator, the tiny human moments that had quietly, secretly, been the only thing making the whole arrangement bearable. Freedom, it turns out, doesn't arrive as a finish line. It arrives as a wide, echoing, undecorated room, and you're standing in the middle of it with the unsettling realization that you now have to build every wall yourself. Nobody tells you this because it doesn't sell the dream. It's much easier to sell the finish line, the beach, the laptop, the sunset, than it is to sell the terrifying blank page of a Tuesday with absolutely nobody expecting anything from you at all. You called an old friend during week 3, someone who'd left the same kind of life a couple of years earlier, and you asked them the question that had been eating at you: does it get less scary? And they told you something that changed the entire shape of the rest of the story. They said, it doesn't get less scary, you just get less afraid of the scary. Sit with that for a second, because it's the whole point of everything we're about to talk about. Here's the truth about escaping the rat race that almost nobody says out loud, because it complicates the fantasy. The rat race was never really about the office. The office was just a container. The rat race is a mindset, a relentless, comparison-driven, achievement-hungry engine that runs in your head whether you're clocking in at a building or clocking in at your own kitchen table. You quit the job. You did not automatically quit the engine. For the first 2 months of your new freedom, you replaced the boss with your own inner critic, and honestly, your inner critic worked you harder than any manager ever had. You woke up early not because you had to, but because some old, deeply grooved part of your brain still believed that rest had to be earned through suffering. You measured your days by output the exact same way you'd measured them in your old job, except now there was no clock to punch, no external permission slip to stop. This is the trap almost nobody survives because it's invisible. You can physically leave the building and still be living inside it. You can walk away from the badge scanner and still carry the badge scanner in your chest. The actual escape, the real one, the one that finally gave you your life back, didn't happen the day you resigned. It happened months later on an ordinary Wednesday when you closed your laptop at 2 in the afternoon simply because you wanted to, with no guilt attached, no inner voice keeping score. You went outside. You sat somewhere quiet, and for the first time in longer than you could remember, you weren't performing rest, you were just resting. That was the real finish line, and exactly zero people were watching when you crossed it. Let's talk about time, because time is the actual currency of this entire story more than money ever was in any country under any name it goes by. In the old life, your time belonged to someone else in tidy sellable blocks, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, for years, stacked on top of years, traded for a wage that always felt, somehow, slightly smaller than the life it was supposed to fund. In the new life, time became yours again, but with that ownership came a responsibility nobody warns you about. When time is no longer being extracted from you by an external system, you become entirely responsible for what you do with it. There's no boss to blame for a wasted afternoon. There's no meeting to resent for eating your morning. There's just you and the choices you make minute by minute, and the slow, sobering realization that freedom and responsibility are the exact same coin, just seen from two different angles. Some days you handled that beautifully. You built things, you learned, you grew a small, quiet version of independence that no manager could take credit for and no performance review could measure. Other days you wasted the whole thing scrolling, frozen by choice, paralyzed by the sheer size of a life with no walls. And on those days, a strange thought crept in, the thought that maybe the rat race hadn't been a prison after all. Maybe it had been training wheels. Maybe you weren't ready for a bicycle with no hands guiding the handlebars. But you were wrong about that. You just hadn't yet built new muscles for a kind of freedom nobody had ever taught you how to hold. Here's the twist in the story, the one that makes this worth telling at all. You didn't escape to be admired. You escaped because staying was slowly erasing you. And somewhere around month 8 of your new life, you stopped needing anyone to notice at all. That's the real ending, and it's a much better one than applause. Because here's what nobody tells you about the people who actually pull this off, the quiet ones, the ones who never post the triumphant leaving day photo, who never write the viral story. They stop needing the audience. The whole engine of the rat race, the promotions, the titles, the performance reviews, the comparison to the person in the next cubicle, all of it runs on being seen, being ranked, being measured against someone else's yardstick. And the actual finish line of escaping it isn't a beach or a bank balance or a beautiful morning routine posted for strangers to envy. It's the moment you do something meaningful, entirely alone, with nobody watching, and you feel completely, quietly whole anyway. You've built a life that doesn't need spectators, and that is precisely why nobody noticed. Not because you failed to escape loudly enough, because you finally stopped needing the noise. So here's where this story actually ends, the part the movie never shows you, because it's not cinematic, but it's true. Somewhere around a year in, you ran into an old coworker at a coffee shop. Small talk, the kind that fills space more than it fills meaning. They asked what you'd been up to. You told them, briefly, honestly, without performance. They nodded, said, "That's great," and the conversation moved on to something else within 30 seconds. That's it. That's the reaction. 30 seconds, and then the world kept spinning exactly like it always had. And you know what? You smiled the whole walk home because you finally understood the sentence that Every quiet escape eventually teaches you if you stay in it long enough to learn it. You were never doing this for them to notice. You were doing this so that you could finally, after all those years, notice yourself. The rat race doesn't end with fireworks. It ends in silence, in an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, in a life built so quietly that the only person who ever really has to see it is you. And if you're standing right now in your own version of that Tuesday at 2:47 in the afternoon, feeling that same small crack forming somewhere in your chest, I want you to know something. Nobody's going to notice when you finally do it either. And that was never the point.